You're listening to The Jacob Valk Show. He's breaking down the latest and greatest in sports as only he can. Follow him on Twitter @RealJacobValk. Here he is, Jacob Valk.
Hello, sports fans! Welcome to another edition of the Jacob Valk Show. I am the Jacob Valk, except no imitation. At the end of this show, you're going to get the interview that I did with Maya Washington, the author of Through the Banks of the Red Cedar, My Father and the Team That Changed the Game. She is a really nice lady. I enjoyed talking to her. I liked reading her book. That was a very good interview. But I've got to start with Cardinals-Rams. Probably the most disappointing NFL game that we've seen so far in these playoffs. You think about the three other blowouts. It was Patriots-Bills, Eagles-Buccaneers, and Steelers-Chiefs. Did anyone really expect the Patriots to beat the Bills? Maybe you thought the game would be closer, but I don't think anyone expected the Bills to lose that game. Eagles-Buccaneers, you knew the Buccaneers would destroy the Eagles. Steelers-Chiefs, you knew the Chiefs would destroy the Steelers. Cardinals-Rams, you didn't know that the Rams would destroy the Cardinals. It's okay if you pick the Rams. Okay, I totally get that. I mean, I picked the Cardinals. I wanted to pick a road team, but look, if you pick the Rams, I totally get it. I mean, regardless of who you picked, I think you expected a really close game. I mean, these were two evenly matched teams. You have two quarterbacks with limited playoff experience going at it. You have two young, bright offensive minds going at it. You've got two really good defenses going at it. This was a very even matchup on paper. But from the word go, the Rams looked like the exponentially better team. The Cardinals had 3 first quarter drives. Here's how all 3 of those drives went. 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out. You know how they started off the second quarter on offense? 3 and out. So their first 4 drives were 3 and outs. By the time they got their first down, they were already down 21-0. This game was a joke. This game was over at halftime. You know when you knew the Rams were going to win this game? When Kyler Murray threw that asinine pick 6. You know when you learn not to do something like that? When you're playing Pop Warner ball. You don't even see high school quarterbacks doing that. What a joke! What a disaster for the Cardinals. Everything that could go right for the Rams went right for the Rams. Matthew Stafford was humming. He was responsible for 3 touchdowns. The running game was solid. Odell Beckham finally exercised his playoff demons. He had 4 catches for 54 yards and a touchdown. He absolutely mossed Marco Wilson on that touchdown catch. That was just insane. It didn't matter that Cooper Kupp didn't have a Cooper Kupp-like game. Other players stepped up. Sonny Michel was solid. Tyler Higbee was solid. 5 Rams caught a pass yesterday. Kupp, Beckham, Higbee, Van Jefferson, and Cam Akers. All 5 of those guys had at least 40 receiving yards. The Cardinals' defense looked lifeless. They looked lost. Sean McVay could call whatever he wanted, and it would work. The man just sees football differently. And it's going to be nice getting that Super Bowl rematch. Sean McVay versus Tom Brady. Now I'll tell you what the turning point of this game was. The turning point of the game was the asinine pick 6 by Murray. Just take the safety. If you're going down, don't try to be a hero. I understand you don't want to go down 16-0, but I'd rather be down 16-0 than 21-0. I mean, he didn't even look. He just floated the ball up and prayed. Well, God answers all prayers, but sometimes his answer is no. David Long will never get an easier pick 6 in his life. You cannot say enough bad things about that pick 6. Let me tell you, that's a fireable offense. That's the kind of play that makes you wonder, should the Cardinals have gone with Colt McCoy? It's clear that the bright lights are getting to Murray. If we want a chance to win this game, should we go with the veteran backup? I can promise you this, Colt McCoy would know not to do that. I mean, Murray looked absolutely ill-prepared for this game. He completed just 19 of 34 passes for 137 yards. He threw 2 interceptions. The Cardinals only had 1 touchdown drive, and that happened when they were already down 28-0. For a quarterback to look that lost in a playoff game is inexcusable, and I understand that it's Kyler Murray's first time playing in the playoffs. Alright, there are some quarterbacks that when they get that first taste of playoff football, they fold like a cheap suit. Eli Manning won 2 Super Bowl MVPs. His first playoff game, he threw 3 interceptions against the Panthers. The Giants got shut out in that game 23-0. The only reason that Tom Brady won his first playoff game was because of that stupid tuck rule. Russell Wilson didn't look great in his first playoff game against the Redskins. I understand that the Seahawks won, but Wilson didn't set the world on fire. Ben Roethlisberger in the Doug Bryan game against the Jets did not play well at all. There's a reason that loss is one of the worst losses in Jets history, which is saying something because the Jets have had a lot of really bad losses. I'm not saying that Kyler Murray is going to go the way of Phillip Rivers, great quarterback that's not going to win anything in the playoffs. But it is inexcusable for a team to look as lost as the Cardinals did yesterday. That cannot happen under any circumstances. And at the end of the day, that's on the head coach. I have given Cliff Kingsbury credit for making the correct decision to move on from Josh Rosen for Kyler Murray a million times. He does have a good mind for offense. There's no question about that. Just look at how Murray's developed. Look at the years that guys like Christian Kirk and A.J. Green and DeAndre Hopkins have had under him at some point. He's a smart guy. There's no question about that. But that does not mean that he is cut out to be a head coach. There are a lot of things that go into being a good head coach. But one of those things is finishing the season strong. Think about it. If you start the season 7-0, but you lose your next 10 games, all people are going to remember is that 10-game losing streak. It's not how you start. It's how you finish. And the Arizona Cardinals, under Cliff Kingsbury, have consistently faltered late in the season. Kingsbury has been with the Cardinals for 3 seasons. His first year, 2019, the Cardinals lost 7 of their last 9 games. The year after that, the Cardinals lost 5 of their last 7 games. The Cardinals were 8-6 at one point. They were in the driver's seat to make the playoffs. What happened? They lost to the Niners and the Rams, finished 8-8, and finished out of the playoffs. This year, the Cardinals lost 4 of their last 5. It looked like they were going to win the NFC West at one point. They end up being a wild card team, and they get steamrolled by the Rams. There are some coaches that are just phase 1 guys. They will get the ship pointed in the right direction, but they won't get you to your ultimate destination. Cliff Kingsbury seems like a phase 1 guy. Let me ask you something. Do you think that Cliff Kingsbury is ever going to win a Super Bowl? I understand that he's young, he's 42. Alright, he's going to be coaching for a long time. And maybe it's unfair to write him off now. But through 3 years, this guy has shown an inability to have his teams finish strong. That does mean something. I mean, you think about what the Red Raiders did in college under him. They only won one bowl game. That does mean something. It shows an inability to finish the season strong. If you can't win your bowl games, how are you ever going to win playoff games? How are you ever going to win a Super Bowl? I mean, that performance yesterday is a fireable offense for Kyler Murray, but it's also a fireable offense for Cliff Kingsbury. And it's a lot easier to fire the head coach than it is to move on from a quarterback as talented as Murray. At the end of the day, the Cardinals have completed phase 1. They have the ship pointed in the right direction. They have a franchise quarterback. They have a really talented team around him. And they made the playoffs. But that's not enough. Phase 2 is going on a big run in the playoffs. And Cliff Kingsbury doesn't strike me as the kind of guy that's going to do that. I mean, just to be clear, I've never been 100% sold on Kingsbury. He's certainly better than I thought he'd be coming out of Texas Tech. I thought that was a terrible decision to hire him. I was glad that the Jets didn't get him. He's not a terrible head coach by any stretch, but he's not great. At the end of the day, when you have a quarterback like Kyler Murray going into what's going to be his 4th year and you haven't won a single playoff game with him, that's tough. It is tough to get behind a head coach with that on his ledger. The thing is, though, if you're the Cardinals and you're seriously considering moving on from Cliff Kingsbury, and there's no reason to think that they are, but it's fair to speculate on it. I mean, it hasn't been reported by a guy like Adam Schefter or Ian Rappaport or Mike Garofalo or someone like that the Cardinals are considering moving on from Kingsbury, but I think it's fair to speculate on, there's no question about that, if they're going to, you need to realize that he's going to be an extremely hot commodity. The Bears would hire him in a second to develop Justin Fields. The Jaguars would hire him in a second to develop Trevor Lawrence. You know the Vikings would be interested in him. The Broncos would be interested in him. The Giants may be interested in him, depending on the GM. You do look foolish when you fire a guy, and then 2 seconds later, he gets hired somewhere else. Does that guarantee that the guy's going to be successful? No. Cough, cough, Adam Gase. Cough, cough, Chip Kelly. But it is something that you need to consider. And at the end of the day, Kingsbury overall has not done a terrible job with the Cardinals. Yes, the lack of playoff success is jarring. There's no question about that. But it's tough to fire a head coach that just went 11-6. It's tough to fire a head coach that was instrumental in developing your franchise quarterback. I'm not saying that Kyler Murray would be nothing without Kingsbury, but there's no question that Kingsbury helped Murray. And Murray has helped Kingsbury. Okay, it's a symbiotic relationship. But I think it's tough to move on from a head coach that's helped develop Murray. Also, if you're going to make that move, you better have a replacement lined up. If the Cardinals are going to move on from Kingsbury, who's taking over for him? They can't go through a whole coaching search. That's not going to work. They need to have a guy in mind and someone who has indicated to them through back channels, yeah, I'll take this job. It doesn't need to be an experienced head coach. It doesn't need to be a Jim Harbaugh type or a Doug Peterson type or a Mike Zimmer type or a Vic Fangio type. If you've coveted a guy like Eric Bieniemy or Brian Daboll or Matt Eberflus or Byron Leftwich from afar for a long time, and one of those guys has indicated to you, yeah, I'll take the Cardinals job, you can move on from Kingsbury for that guy. I have no problem with that. But you can't go through a whole coaching search and not know who you're going to hire if you move on from Kingsbury. If you're going to make that move, you better know for sure who you're getting to replace him. We're not at the point where the Cardinals absolutely need to move on from Kingsbury. It's clear as day that it's in the best interest of their franchise to move on from him. Can we get there sooner rather than later? The answer is yes. That's why I'm not opposed to moving on from him now. But if you're gonna move on from him now, you better have his replacement lined up, and it better be someone good. Not some off-the-wall candidate like Luke Getsy, or Aaron Glenn, or Hines Ward, or Thomas Brown. It needs to be a notable name. Again, though, gun to my head, I think Kingsbury's going to be back with the Cardinals for a fourth season. And I wouldn't hate it. He'd just be on the hot seat. He'd need to lead the Cardinals deep into the playoffs to earn a fifth year. And there is one other thing that deserves mentioning. Why was Cliff Kingsbury hired in the first place? Because the Cardinals wanted their own Sean McVay. Because they wanted their own young offensive guru. It's fitting that Kingsbury lost to the guy who blazed the trail for him. There is some delicious irony there. I brought up the Giants a little earlier. There is some interesting news about them. According to Ryan Dunleavy of the New York Post, Brian Flores and Desean Watson are interested in joining forces next year. Dunleavy pointed to the Giants as a possible home for that duo. You think about the teams that need head coaches. The Bears have their quarterback in Justin Fields. The Broncos haven't requested an interview with Flores. The Texans are out of the question for obvious reasons. The Jaguars have their quarterback in Trevor Lawrence. I think the Raiders are going to stick with Rich Bisaccia. And I don't see them moving on from Derek Carr for Desean Watson, given all their off-the-field turmoil this year with Gruden, Henry Ruggs, and Damon Arnett. The Dolphins are out of the equation for obvious reasons. And the Vikings haven't requested an interview with Flores. The Giants really haven't been linked to too many coaching candidates. We've heard Brian Daboll and we've heard Brian Flores, but you get the sense that the Giants are waiting to hire a new GM before they zero in on a head coach, which is the correct way to do things. Alright, there's no question about that. I don't like the forced pairings. I just don't think it works. But Dunleavy's right. I do think that the Giants make the most sense for a Flores and Watson duo. And make no mistake about it, the Giants have the ammo to trade for Watson. Remember when the Jets last year were linked heavily to Watson? It was partially because they had 2 firsts. The Giants have 2 firsts. They have 5 and 7. I could even see them throwing Daniel Jones into that trade. I could really see the Giants pulling this off. And whoever the new GM is, if he does this, he will become more beloved than any GM in Giants history, with the exception of maybe George Young. Maybe. He'd be more beloved than Jerry Reese, even when the Giants were winning Super Bowls. Reese didn't get the lion's share of the credit. The lion's share of the credit went to Tom Coughlin. And it went to Eli, and it went to the great defense. Reese got some credit, but it was more Coughlin. Now, there are some hurdles to this. Who did the Giants just fire? Joe Judge. Where was Joe Judge before he got to the Giants? The Patriots. Where did Brian Flores earn his stripes? The Patriots. In fact, from 2012 to 2018, Flores and Judge were on the Patriots together. Do you want to bring in a Belichick disciple right after you fired another Belichick disciple? The Bill Belichick coaching tree is dreadful. No one has worked out in the NFL. Nick Saban failed, Al Groh failed, Romeo Crennel failed, Eric Mangini failed, Josh McDaniels failed, Jim Schwartz failed. Bill O'Brien's probably the best one, but his tenure with the Texans ended dreadfully. Matt Patricia failed. Brian Flores didn't do a terrible job with the Dolphins, but didn't set the world on fire. and Joe Judge failed. If your two best branches are Bill O'Brien and Brian Flores, do you really want to go back to that tree? Now I'll say this, Flores and Judge strike me as different guys. There is something to be said about a guy like Desean Watson indicating that he wants to play for Brian Flores. That tells me that he's an easy coach to play for, unlike Judge, who was an incredibly hard coach to play for. Part of the reason why he didn't work out. He was an incredibly strict disciplinarian. That approach doesn't work in the NFL anymore. He just wasn't a good leader of men. It was doomed to fail. Flores, I don't get that with. I think it's something you need to think about, but I wouldn't let that stop me from hiring a guy who was born and raised in Brooklyn. I mean, this guy grew up a Giants fan. This guy has proven that he can coach in the NFL. 2 winning seasons, and the 1 year that wasn't a winning season, people thought the Dolphins could go 0-16. The Dolphins went 5-11 that year. Brian Flores would be an absolutely perfect fit with the Giants. And Watson, look, there's no question that the Giants would face a PR backlash. How can you bring in someone who's been accused of all this? And Dunleavy said that the Giants are still recovering from what happened with Josh Brown. If you'll recall, Brown admitted to abusing his wife. The Giants kept him on the team, then backtracked after outrage. They finally cut him, but the damage had been done. So look, this extracurricular stuff, the stuff that has nothing to do with play on the field, is stuff that you need to consider when bringing in your next head coach. If Flores is going to bang his fist on the table and say, I want Desean Watson, I don't want anyone else, I want him to be my quarterback, that's something that you need to keep in the back of your mind. Are you willing to withstand the PR nightmare? Now, I'll say this. Giants fans have longed for elite quarterback play for years. They are done. They are fed up with the losing. This is a team that hasn't won a playoff game since 2012. They've gone through a ton of head coaches. They had to withstand the Daniel Jones experiment. Giants fans are fed up. They want an elite quarterback. They'll take Desean Watson. Most Giants fans will say that they'll take the good with the bad. Obviously, they don't approve of what Watson's alleged to have done, but at the end of the day, that's not going to stop them from rooting for this guy. That's not going to stop them from buying his jersey and watching him every Sunday. It's not going to stop them from hoping and praying that he can lead the Giants back to the playoffs. The Flores and Watson pairing with the Giants could work. Like, that could lead the Giants back to the promised land. You have a really good head coach, someone who I understand comes from the Patriots system, but the results don't lie. This guy has gotten the job done. And you have a quarterback in Desean Watson, who's easily one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the NFL if he comes back. It's a big if, there's no question. You don't know what his punishment is going to be. You don't know how he's going to look after taking a year off from football. But I'd bet on him returning to form. Dak Prescott returned to form. I think Desean Watson will return to form also. A Flores and Watson pairing makes perfect sense. And if I was John Mara, I'd bring in a GM who'd move heaven and earth to make that happen. I brought up the Raiders a little bit earlier. They will not bring back Mike Mayock. The Raiders will need a new GM, and this is the right decision. While John Gruden had final say over everything, Mayock was still in the room. He did a lot of the scouting. I mean, Mayock was the NFL Network's version of Mel Kiper. That's all Mayock did. I'll never forget, in 2009, he said that Mark Sanchez would be better than Matthew Stafford. And even though Mayock hit on some late rounders, guys like Max Crosby and Hunter Renfrow, Nate Hobbs too, you can't survive that 2020 draft. The way that draft failed is inexcusable. It's one thing if you're going to draft busts. Alright, like Joe Douglas drafted a ton of busts in 2020. Denzel Mims, Ashton Davis, Jabari Zuniga, etc., etc. The thing is, though, those guys didn't flame out like the Raiders' picks did. The Raiders had 7 picks in that draft, all in the first 4 rounds. Let's examine the 7. Henry Ruggs, gonna spend a lot of time in prison. Damon Arnett. A video was taken of him holding a gun and making death threats. Lynn Bowden was traded before he ever played a game for the Raiders. Brian Edwards, somehow, some way, is still with the Raiders, but hasn't set the world on fire. Last year, he had 34 catches for 571 yards and 3 touchdowns. He can't be the best player in a draft class. That's not going to work. He's not a terrible player, but he's not great either. Tanner Muse never played a regular season snap for the Raiders. He's now with the Seahawks. John Simpson had a 53 overall grade for the Raiders. Amick Robertson had an anemic 37.2 overall grade for the Raiders. So just to recap, we have a criminal, someone who makes death threats, someone who was traded before ever playing a game for the Raiders, a solid wide receiver, but nothing spectacular, someone who was traded before ever playing a game for the Raiders and 2 busts. You cannot survive that if you're Mike Mayock. The thing is, though, this is very tricky for the Raiders, because I think the best thing for them to do is to keep Rich Bisaccia. He held that team together after becoming interim head coach, led them to the playoffs, nearly beat a superior Bengals team. I think he's earned the full-time job. So what are you going to do? Bring in a GM and say, no, you have to keep Bisaccia? I understand that that's been done before, but it usually doesn't end well. So does this open up the possibility that the Raiders are going to clean house? They're going to tear down the front office that Gruden put in place, and they're going to tear down the coaching staff that Gruden put in place? Look, I don't mind that. I said they should do that when this all started. But a half measure isn't going to work. There are only 2 directions that Mark Davis can go in right now. I don't mind firing Mike Mayock, but you either promote from within in terms of who's going to be your new GM. Maybe a guy like Dwayne Joseph, who's been an executive since 1998, won a Super Bowl with the Eagles, has been with the Raiders for a while. He would make sense. He could keep Bisaccia. Bisaccia could keep some of Gruden's coaches and bring in some other guys who he knows. Or you blow things up. You hire from outside the organization and you say, you know what? This is Gruden's roster. His fingerprints are all over this. We're gonna tear this thing down and build it back up. And we're gonna repair our reputation. But a half measure isn't gonna work. I don't even like the idea of going outside the organization for a new GM and a new head coach, but keeping most of the roster. This is a John Gruden roster. This roster is built to run his system. It has his fingerprints all over it. I just don't think it's going to work. Either promote from within and run it back, which I'm not mad at, or hire an outside GM and an outside head coach and blow up the roster. I don't mind that either. Anything else, I'm going to strongly disapprove of. There was a death in the sports world that happened over the weekend. But as I said yesterday, I wanted to keep that show solely dedicated to the NFL playoffs. It's okay to eulogize this guy now. It's not passé at all. And that, of course, is Joe B. Hall, who died on Saturday at the age of 93. Joe B. Hall had the unenviable task of taking over for Adolph Rupp. Say what you want about Adolph Rupp, but he's probably the best coach in Kentucky history. I would put him over Calipari. So whenever you're taking over for a legend, you're carrying that guy's legacy with you, whether you like it or not. For most people, that would be way too hard. But Hall hit it out of the park. He was a head coach for a couple other teams before he got to Kentucky. He coached the Regis Rangers and the Central Missouri State Mules for a little bit. You don't need to know too much about that. When Rupp said to Hall, "I want you to be one of my assistants," Hall couldn't wait to make the jump to the big boys. Rupp retired at the age of 70. That was when all University of Kentucky employees had to retire. Hall was selected as his successor. The first thing that Hall did was make a concerted effort to recruit black players. Adolph Rupp recruited very few black players. There had only been 3 in Wildcats history before Hall got there. Hall changed that and recruited great black players. Guys like Sam Bowie, Mel Turpin, Kenny Walker, etc., etc. In 1975, the Wildcats went 26-5. They had the 4th best offense in the nation in terms of points per game. Kevin Grevy had a great season that year. He put up 23.5 points per game. Jimmy Dan Connor was really good. Rick Roby was really good. The Wildcats destroyed Marquette in the first round of March Madness. They then scored at least 90 points from the Sweet 16 to the Final Four. They beat Central Michigan, Indiana, and Syracuse in that order. Then they went up against UCLA in the national title game, but lost 92-85. In 1978, the Wildcats went 30-2. They were an incredibly well-rounded team that year. Jack Givens was really good. Rick Roby was really good. Kyle Macy, James Lee, and Mike Phillips were all solid. For whatever it's worth, Givens and Lee are black. Kentucky was dominant that year. Now, it did kind of stop once we got to March Madness. They beat FSU by 9 in the first round, but they were down by 7 at the half. They destroyed Miami of Ohio in the Sweet 16. Okay, fair enough. Then against Magic Johnson's Spartans, they only won by 3 points, 52-49. Against Sidney Moncrief's Razorbacks, Kentucky only won by 5, 64-59. Then in the national title game, Kentucky won a high-scoring game against Duke, 94-88. Givens had a sensational game. He had 41 points. Rick Roby had a double-double, 20 points and 11 rebounds. Kentucky was by far and away the best team in the nation that year. The biggest issue with Joe B. Hall is that the year after his teams were great, they always had a major letdown. I didn't talk about what the Wildcats did in 75-76. There was a reason for that. They didn't even make the big dance. They made the NIT. Now, they won the NIT, but this wasn't back when the NIT was the better tournament. People cared more about March Madness in the 70s. In 78-79, the Wildcats, again, made the NIT. You know what happened? They were bounced in the first round. They lost to Clemson, 68-67. In Hall's penultimate year coaching, 83-84. The Wildcats were great. They went 29-5. That was the Turpin, Walker, and Bowie year. Kentucky destroyed BYU. Then in the Sweet 16, they barely got by Louisville, 72-67. In the Elite Eight, they barely got by Illinois, 54-51. Then against a great Georgetown team, they lost in the Final Four, 53-40. They only scored 11 points in the second half. But still, they made it to the Final Four. It was a good season. It was the only year that Kentucky under Hall won the SEC regular season and conference titles. What did they do Hall's last year? They went 18-13. They didn't win anything. They made March Madness, won a couple games, but they got destroyed by St. John's in the Sweet 16. But look, Joe B. Hall was a great coach. He finished his Kentucky career with a career record of 297 and 100. He has the third most wins in Kentucky history. Did an excellent job in keeping up the winning tradition that Adolph Rupp established. There's a statue of Hall at the University of Kentucky, and rightfully so. May he rest in peace. Alright, here's my interview with Maya Washington.
You're listening to the Jacob Valk Show. I'm Jacob Valk, and I'm fortunate enough to be joined by Maya Washington, the author of Through the Banks of the Red Cedar, My Father and the Team That Changed the Game. Maya, how are you?
I am great.
All right, sounds good. So, when did you first realize that your father was a famous football player?
You know, I feel like it was probably in my early childhood. I feel like we were out to dinner and someone came up and asked for his autograph, which seemed kind of strange to me, I think, but normal to everyone else. So I think that's when I started to figure out he was a little different, you know, than the other dads in the neighborhood.
Right, right. Yeah, that's not something that has ever happened with my father. No one's ever come up to him and asked for his autograph when we've been out to dinner or something. So, What can you tell us about Clinton Jones?
Clinton Jones is among one of my favorite gifts that's come out of this process of making a film and now a book, because he was my dad's teammate at both Michigan State and the Minnesota Vikings. And after my dad went to the Broncos and Clinton went to San Diego, their lives kind of, took different paths. They stayed in touch, but our families weren't as close, for the latter part of my childhood and early adulthood. And so he is just an amazing guy. He's become this, second dad, uncle, mystic, guru type person in my life, who, if the phone rings and I see it's Clinton Jones, I know I'm going to be in for an hour-long conversation and enjoy every minute of it. So he's like a Foxy twin to my dad. My dad's very conservative, stoic, whereas Clinton is a little more on the mushy side and a little more of that sort of gregarious personality. So he's a real gem and an amazing college football Hall of Famer.
Right. I like hearing that. I like hearing that a lot. So what was it like for your father to play for Duffy Dougherty at MSU?
He describes it as an amazing experience, mainly because he came from segregation, where opportunities like this were few and far between for black men in the South at that time. So first and foremost, that opportunity to get an education, but also to achieve as an athlete. He actually was recruited on a track scholarship. So he had to run indoor and outdoor track. He's a high hurdle champion, and play football for Duffy Dougherty. So it was a rigorous experience. It was a lot of hard work, but he and his teammates accomplished a great deal at Michigan State as national champions 2 years in a row.
No question about that. Let's get into those games right now. Can you lay out the 1966 Rose Bowl?
So the Rose Bowl, the team was favored to win and had, done what they needed to do against UCLA earlier in the season. But when they met them on the field at the Rose Bowl, everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and they ended up losing the game by 2 points. So it was this devastating blow for Michigan State. And the thing that really was significant about the fact that they lost, you could only go to the Rose Bowl once. You couldn't go in consecutive years. And so my dad's senior year, they weren't able to, have that opportunity to go back to the Rose Bowl because they had just gone the year before. So their last game against Notre Dame, which is famous.
We'll get into it.
The game of the century. But yeah, that Rose Bowl experience was really devastating and shocking for my dad and his teammates. It was really significant because they had numbers in terms of African Americans on the field as starters. Jimmy Ray, also a black quarterback, played backup to Steve Jude throughout that game. So it was just really one of those nail biter games is what I imagine. I've only seen old film footage of it.
You and me both.
But that game itself, I can only imagine what kind of nail biter it must have been for the people who were in the stands.
Oh, how would you describe the 1966 Notre Dame versus MSU game? You said it was the game of the century, but I'd like you to go a little more in depth on it. You're 100% right. Iconic game. Go a little deeper on it for me if you can. Well,
as I said, they had just lost the year prior in the Rose Bowl. So, to get to the end of your season and hope to be named national champions, the system was very different than what we have now. You know, we have this like tournament structure now, which is still kind of unfolding and evolving. But there wasn't an actual game. You know, teams didn't get to, you know, duke it out to be declared, you know, national champion. It was really based on what pollsters had to say about you and your record. So for Michigan State to be up against Notre Dame, the last game in Michigan State season, Notre Dame still had one game to go at USC. And for the Spartans to, you know, come into that, you know, undefeated. And this was, for people who were alive at that time and the people who attended, this is like, you know, as big, if not bigger than the Super Bowl, to see these two teams go head-to-head. And what happened was another kind of, you know, surprise that it ended in an actual tie, 10-10. So there was no definitive winner of that game. Bubba Smith took out the Terry Hanratty, like literally took him out of the game with a shoulder dislocation. They played the players on both sides. I've talked to Alan Page from the Notre Dame team, also, you know, a Minnesota Viking and former Supreme Court Justice, as well as my dad's teammates at Michigan State. And, you know, they describe it as a complete and utter dogfight, that they, you know, were duking it out. But in those last few seconds, Eric Parsegian, the coach at Notre Dame, opted to run out the clock. At least that's how Spartans perceive it, because they knew they still had another game and did not want to risk a turnover or a loss, and the game ended in a tie. So it is known, it's notorious, mainly because it ended in a tie.
Tie one for the Gipper instead of win one for the Gipper.
Tie one for the Gipper, exactly.
You gotta love it. So, how did your father feel about being drafted by the Vikings?
You know, it was really, I think, an exciting moment for him, but the way it happened was a little on the confusing side. You know, we didn't have, they didn't have the draft like they have now, where it's this big, you know, televised production, and we get the whole backstory of, you know, our first-round picks. My dad got called into the football office at Michigan State and, you know, was told there was someone on the line that wanted to talk to him, and the person on the other line was like, "Congratulations, Gene Washington, you've been drafted in the first round to the Minnesota Vikings." And he was like, "Thanks, who is this?" And it was Sid Hartman, a local sports writer in Minnesota, that broke the news. It wasn't even the Minnesota Vikings. And so he was, you know, happy and surprised, but also a little confused. You know, it was days before the team called because the manager had been in the hospital, and the team had conducted the draft from Jim Fink's, you know, hospital room. And I think for him, there was nothing to prepare him for this moment. He knew that a draft was, you know, possible. But for him, alongside his teammates, to be drafted in the first round, his teammate Bubba Smith was number 1, Clinton Jones was number 2, George Webster was number 5, and then my dad was the 8th pick overall. And to have 4 players from one school all in the first round was completely unprecedented. And he was excited, you know, about the opportunity, but, you know, was engaged to my mom, and they had to kind of navigate and figure out where they would live. So it was a really exciting kind of whirlwind senior year for my dad. That unfolded not too long, you know, after that 10-10 tie in 1966.
Right. Now, the best pro team that your father played on was the 1969 Vikings. What can you tell us about that team?
They were just, you know, truly outstanding. The Vikings fans, and even people who aren't maybe diehard football fans, I think most people, when they think of the Vikings, they think of the Purple People Eaters. And it was because they had this outstanding defensive line. They had Joe Kapp as their quarterback, my dad, and a number of really great wide receivers that led them to be, champions and to play in one of the last NFL championship, and win. The cool thing about that team is that at the end of the season, Joe Kapp was named most valuable player. And in his speech, he said, I am not the most valuable Viking. There isn't one. And developed this slogan, 40 for 60, that it's 40 guys, playing for 60 minutes and doing it as a team. And,
very classy.
Very, very classy. So not only were they excellent and amazing players and, one of the best teams in franchise history, they were classy men and very much a family.
All right, Maya, I'll get you out on this. How impacted were you by Bubba Smith's death?
I don't even know that I can articulate, how deeply it impacted me. It makes me, emotional to think about the fact that he's the reason my dad got to Michigan State University. That recommendation that his father and he gave to Duffy Doherty changed my dad's life. And that changed my life, of course, my siblings' life. It changed what was possible for our entire family. But it also had ripple effects for other black athletes who would later go on to play at Michigan State or other teams in the country. And so to not be able to thank Bubba Smith personally for the impact that he had on my father's life, gutted me. And to this day, still weighs on my heart because it was such a tremendous gesture that I am so grateful for, and hope that the little bit of work that I've done keeps Bubba Smith's name in people's minds and hearts because he was a tremendous athlete, a tremendous contributor to the sport, but also just an awesome human being. So I would say that is the impact.
Yeah, I'm sure that he's looking down and is very proud of what you've done to keep his name alive, Maya. I'm confident about that. How does that sound?
It sounds good. I hope so.
All right. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right. That was Maya Washington. Her book is Through the Banks of the Red Cedar, My Father and the Team That Changed the Game. Thanks for listening. Here comes the outro.
Thanks for the plug, Jacob from the past. It does mean a lot. Until tomorrow, I'm Jacob Valk, and always remember, if you disagree with me, you're wrong.